Optimal health for high performers. This is the Health Upgrade Podcast with Dr. Nawaz Habib.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Habib, and I'm doing a little bit of a different episode today. And so let's talk a little bit about blood work that is involved in vagus nerve. Specifically, what blood work should we be doing to identify those issues that can affect the vagus nerve in a negative way or positive way, depending on your results. So truly, if you want better vagal tone, there's two things you want to target. Those are inflammation and metabolic stress. And so we're going to go through three important blood work markers that you should be looking at to identify if you have some sort of drag or friction that's causing vagus nerve dysfunction in the first place. Let's get into them. Number one is high sensitivity CRP or C-reactive protein. So hsCRP is kind of this inflammatory block to the vagal brake. So as we kind of understand in the analogy, the vagus nerve is kind of the brakes to inflammation within the body. Its job is to send out acetylcholine to amplify that message through the spleen and to have that signal reduce our immune system hyperactivity or activity in the inflammatory realm. When we have excess amounts of inflammation, you can imagine that we're fighting against a lot more inflammatory issues. So high sensitivity CRP is elevated in these situations of chronic low-grade inflammation, and it's associated with reduced vagal tone or vagal modulation. We know that vagus nerve activity sends acetylcholine, activates this alpha-7 nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, and downstream of that, it shuts down the release of inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha, IL-1 beta, and IL-6. These are signaling molecules that the immune system uses to send out and shut down or to increase inflammatory reactions. This triggers more inflammation, more immune cells to come in and for the fight against whatever the threat is to be increased. But what if that threat is gone and the inflammation continues? The role of the vagus nerve is when the threat is gone to dampen or lower that inflammatory issue. In the same way that when our car is driving really fast and we have to push the brakes really hard and the brakes wear down, you can imagine if that's happening constantly. If you've ever ridden a bike and they've said when you're going downhill, you don't want to ride your brakes. It's because gravity is pulling against your brakes. What you want to do is pump the brakes slowly. If you ride your brakes, if you hold your brakes really long, you're going to wear down the brake pads more quickly. And that's really what's happening when we have a high level of chronic or low-grade inflammation that is continuing. It's almost like we're going downhill and our vagus nerve has more to fight against. And so the brakes are able to do the job until they break down or until they wear off. And that's what's happening with the vagus nerve. It's a very similar analogy. So with high sensitivity CRP, it's telling us that there is this low-grade inflammation that is occurring. What are the ranges that we want to see? In general, for low risk, you want to be below 1 milligram per liter, 1.0. Moderate risk level, if you're between 1 and 3, it's telling us that your risk level is increasing. 1 to 3 milligrams per liter is moderate risk, and anything over 3 is telling us that the risk is quite high, that you're dealing with a lot of inflammation. What you want to aim for, though, is lower risk over time. You want to bring that hsCRP marker down over time. Keep in mind that hsCRP is sensitive to infections, or if you've done heavy exercise, it can increase as well. So make sure that you're testing it at times when you feel pretty good. You're not dealing with some sort of acute issue as well. Okay? The link here, hsCRP, increased inflammation, that lowers HRV, and that impairs vagal tone. And what that leads to is hyperactivated inflammatory cytokines and chronic low-grade inflammation. A couple of action steps that you can take to reduce these markers. A big one is omega-3 activation, omega-3 supplementation or nutrition. Getting in omega-3s, fish oils, well-sourced, make sure, and polyphenols. These are absolutely phenomenal at reducing inflammation levels. I've even found SPMs, these are specialized pro-resolving mediators, to be very effective in reducing HSCRP markers. The big one and the basic one is sleep regularity, getting good sleep, making sure that you're not dealing with a sleep debt, making sure that your sleep quality is increased, that you're getting at minimum 7 hours of sleep per night. These are huge pieces to the puzzle. And movement, especially aerobic movement, is really good at lowering that HSCRP marker down. Okay. I'm always a fan of, layering these practices or stacking parasympathetic practices like nasal breathing, stimulation, electrical stimulation together to help to decrease these cytokines over weeks. It takes time to lower your CRP. So make sure that you're not expecting this to happen really quickly, but make sure that you're impacting your inflammatory burden pretty significantly. HSCRP is a very important marker when it comes to causing vagus nerve dysfunction. So definitely look into that one. The second one here is hemoglobin A1C. And this is where we get into the metabolic function. So hemoglobin A1C is a marker of glycemic load and vagal tone impairment or vagus nerve impairment. This matters because as we have a higher hemoglobin A1C, and that is telling us that we have chronic hyperglycemia, meaning that our blood sugars are high, hemoglobin A1C is measuring the average blood sugar for the past 3 months, approximately. And it's pretty close, it's pretty good. And this is a marker that is heavily linked to autonomic function. So when we deal with higher levels of blood sugar for a long period of time, which we know as chronic hyperglycemia, this is linked to vagus nerve dysfunction and decreased autonomic function. Your body doesn't truly know the difference between physical stress and biochemical stress. It's going to react in the same way. Biochemical stress comes from inflammatory cytokines, just as we mentioned, the TNF alpha, IL-1, IL-6, but we're also thinking about blood sugar levels. If you're chronically in the 6.0, 6.5, 7.0 area, that tells us that you're chronically hyperglycemic, that your blood sugar is too high for a long period of time. That's biochemical stress that your body is constantly needing to deal with. It's constantly getting your vagus nerve to send signals to your pancreas saying, we need more insulin, and we need to lower this. And then all those cells that are listening to this insulin are getting annoyed and they become resistant to the insulin. And that creates what we now know as insulin resistance, which is on the exact same path that pushes us towards type 2 diabetes. We also know that metabolic conditions here lead to many other chronic conditions. Things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, things like cancer are definitely on the metabolic side. We need to have a lower hemoglobin A1C marker, and we need to have associated markers that are also on the lower side. There was a really great study that came out relatively recently showing that the healthiest populations in the world, these blue zones, tended to have the highest insulin sensitivity, meaning the lowest insulin resistance. That is so huge and so important to understand that metabolic function is directly linked to your longevity. When it comes to that hemoglobin A1C marker, your normal is going to be, or optimal, let's go with optimal, is between 4.5 and 5.5%. That's where we want to be. And that 4.5 to 5.5% is telling us that we're optimally able to maintain our blood sugar levels and not allow it to go to a hyperglycemic level or even just a low grade too much blood sugar. So that low grade area is kind of between the 5.7 and 6.4, which is actually known as prediabetes. So I like to say that kind of 5.5 to 5.7, we're dealing with insulin resistance. 5.7 to 6.4, we're in prediabetes. And then 6.5% and above is notably the diagnostic criteria for type 2 diabetes. We now also are able to link that autonomic dysfunction, vagus nerve dysfunction, low HRV, and these metabolic conditions are directly tied together. So metabolic function is huge. Highly recommend lowering that hemoglobin A1C marker and getting it as close to that optimal as possible. And how do we do that? Well, a few action steps. Something we talk a lot about on the podcast is fasting. Fasting is incredibly powerful in helping to reduce insulin resistance. Doesn't mean you have to fast for long periods of time. That said, it can be very beneficial, but it needs to be on a very individualized basis. So if you've never fasted before, maybe skipping one meal and allowing you to have some water instead of that meal per day is a great way to get started. You can always lean it out and open that up into something that's greater. Second thing, if you're not ready to start with fasting, and that's okay, it's not for everybody, at least start with some post-meal glucose control. Things like eating the protein and vegetables, high fiber parts of your meal first. So high fiber and high protein are not going to spike your blood sugar. And then what we can do is start walking for 10 to 15 minutes after your meal. So once you've rested, digested, got that meal into your belly, go for a walk or do 10 squats or do something to build up those leg muscles, because they're going to utilize the sugars in your bloodstream more efficiently and effectively, not requiring insulin to do so. Sleep is massive when it comes to blood sugar as well. We know that sleep is going to improve your mitochondrial function, it's going to improve your glycemic variability, and it also is directly linked to improved HRV. So making sure that you're making sleep an absolute priority. Huge piece to the puzzle when it comes to lowering that hemoglobin A1C marker and that metabolic burden that so many people are dealing with. The third marker that I want to talk about is the triglyceride to HDL ratio. And this is a very practical insulin resistance lens. This is not a direct or a single lab, okay? Not like HSCRP or hemoglobin A1C. This is a ratio between triglycerides and HDLs. So triglycerides and HDLs, when there's a creation of a ratio here, what we're looking at is a proxy for insulin resistance. This is, again, another cardiometabolic risk factor that impacts our autonomic function and particularly our vagus nerve, because as we have a higher ratio, it tells us that we're dealing with significant issues with vagal tone and lower inflammatory signaling. So insulin resistance, inflammation, and autonomic dysregulation, as we've mentioned, are all intertwined. And so a big focus for triglyceride to HDL ratio is to improve metabolic flexibility, and that tends to raise your HRV. That's as we become more metabolically flexible, more insulin sensitive, we're going to have lower burden on our vagus nerve. It's not like we're going to be going down that hill or needing to push our brakes going down against gravity. So, big action step to help improve your triglyceride to HDL ratio is dietary pattern emphasizing whole foods. Omega-3s are huge in supporting this triglyceride HDL ratio. They make sure that when we're getting good quality omega-3s into our diets, we're actually able to raise that HDL number, and that lowers the ratio. That's what we want. And we want to reduce our intake of refined carbohydrates. If possible, even like a pulsed or a patterned out ketogenic style or low carb diet where you're pulsing through, you're doing it in stages, can be very beneficial. And we just reduce our intake of these refined carbohydrates, which we know are a major push towards that high sugar and increase in triglyceride levels. It also will lower our HDL. So we definitely want to make sure that we limit those. We've never in human history had so many carbohydrates within our diet, specifically refined carbs. One big thing that you can also do for triglyceride HDL ratio is to incorporate strength training in combination with an aerobic base. So what I like to do is I like to do 2 to 3 strength training workouts per week and 2 or 3 cardio trainings per week. And you can alternate those. Give yourself 4 to 5 days of workouts with a couple of recovery days. There's ways to make this work. You can even stack these where you do 20 to 30 minutes of weight training and then 20 to 30 minutes of cardio in one day and then take a rest day. And make sure that you're incorporating these recovery times into your daily movement patterns. Big fan of tracking your HRV to see what's going on with that and tracking that parallel improvement that can occur. This is where working with a practitioner can be really handy because we can help to identify these trends and help you track them and make sure that we're seeing things moving in the right direction, just like I do with many of my clients and looking at their wearable data and their specifically their blood work and functional lab testing. We like to incorporate it all, create a full picture of what's going on, and then help you understand what those tracking metrics are. A couple of honorable mentions when it comes to testing as well. I'm a big fan of fasting glucose and specifically fasting insulin, because fasting insulin is telling us, in the context of your hemoglobin A1C marker, are we doing that? Are we keeping your hemoglobin A1C or your blood sugars in check without needing to pump out so much insulin? That's an important sign. So fasting insulin is a great marker to tell us how hard the pancreas is working specifically. There's a homeostatic model assessment of insulin resistance called HOMA-IR, and that is an early window into the insulin resistance marker. So that's a great way to pull together these fasting glucose, fasting insulin markers to help look at the changes even before your hemoglobin A1C shows up. And that's important to track with HRV changes. So if you notice HRV is going down, but we're not seeing a high hemoglobin A1C, HOMA-IR can tell you whether it's an insulin resistance issue that's occurring pre-hemoglobin A1C marker popping up. The next marker is not a blood work marker, it's wearable data. It's resting heart rate variability and heart rate recovery as functional biomarkers. I know these are not blood work, but these are absolutely huge, indispensable markers for gauging vagal nerve status and intervention of efficacy. We can see how things are changing in your body based on HRV daily or heart rate recovery levels daily. That's a huge marker that cannot be missed out on. And if you have the capacity to, checking your inflammatory cytokines, your IL-6, your TNF-alpha, IL-1 beta, these tell us if you are dealing with a specific type of inflammation. And these are generally research grade, but some people do have the ability to get these markers in their blood work. So if you have it and you have the means, please go ahead and do those. It's good to check for what's going on. So let's end with a simple protocol. What are a few things that people can do by pulling together these three markers? We've got our HSCRP, our high sensitivity C-reactive protein. We've got our hemoglobin A1C, and we've got that lipid panel from which we pull out the triglyceride to HDL ratio. And then we can add in the optional fasting insulin, the optional other markers, your HRV and whatnot, and tracking that over a period of time while tracking HRV and heart rate recovery, that can be really helpful. On the nutrition side, focus on anti-inflammatory nutrition, high levels of omega-3s, whole foods, relatively high fiber, good quality protein. These are all going to support your lowering of inflammatory burden and your metabolic function optimization. The big one, I've talked about this now 3 times at least, but it's sleep. Focus on improving your sleep. Sleep is where your vagus nerve does its best work. It's the gym for the vagus nerve. Stay consistent with it. Improve that sleep window. Create a bookend routine for the end of your day, ending up with you falling asleep. That's a great way to get your body into a pattern of managing to go into this consistent pattern. Consistency is the key to this. When it comes to movement, we want to look at zone 2 and light strengthening exercise and daily breath work for managing that stress that's always going to occur. It doesn't need to be heavy breath work. It can be a simple 5 minutes of basic breathing exercise. Really, really powerful in supporting this. We know that breath is the key to improving vagus nerve function, but why not give the biochemistry an option to support that and not be a burden on the vagus nerve? One big thing that I love to add in where it's necessary and where it's appropriate is vagus nerve stimulation. VNS is a really powerful way to help lower inflammatory burden and to lower and support metabolic function. I really think that vagus nerve stimulation can be a game changer for a lot of people, particularly those that are dealing with a chronic diagnosis. So taking a look at that potentially adding that into your bookend routine or into your plan, a really powerful tool for many people. All right. So I really want to pull this together and just say that optimizing vagus nerve is not just breath work. I love the breath, and you know that I'm all about it, but it comes down to a systemic approach. We need to lower the inflammatory burden on the body. We need to stabilize glucose levels, and we need to make sure that our lipid levels are optimized. And these things all together allow the vagus nerve to then do its job really effectively. Your hemoglobin A1C reflects your glycemic friction, the gravity by which we're being pulled down. And so if you have high hemoglobin A1C plus a high sensitivity CRP that's high, and you have this ratio of triglyceride to HDL that's less than optimal, what that's going to do is it's going to be resistance or friction against vagus nerve function. When we change those around, that supports vagus nerve. It allows the vagus nerve to not have to fight against the gravitational pull down. Let's bring it all together. Breathing better is absolutely the key, but making the biochemistry work more effectively and more easily allows vagus nerve to jump online and to help you win and succeed in this journey towards optimal health. I hope this has been really powerful, really eye-opening, and just simple, easy tools that you can take home and literally go look at your blood work and see what's going on. These 3 markers are the top ones. If you haven't had your blood work done, I'm going to highly, highly recommend that you go and do that as quickly as possible. Blood work is the key to validation, and validation is the number one step in understanding exactly what's happening within your body. Let's get some testing so we don't have to keep guessing. Take this, run with it. I hope this has been beneficial. We'll see you all on the next one.